Right, so firstly, just an overview of this session. I'm going to go through what I do, and then a tiny bit on history and philosophy of art and Holocaust art, and then go into artworks in the JHC, in the museum, as well as incidentally around you and in other spaces, and then looking to the future, and then we'll have a space for discussion and questions. What do? I document collections, and people bring in their family collections. They can be photographs, ID cards, documents, textiles, artefacts from prior to the Holocaust, through the Holocaust period, and then immediately after. So we're also interested in what happened to people at the end of the war, people in DP camps, people waiting for their visas, people in these sort of spaces. And I also supervise volunteers who range from university students up to retirees. And I also mentor interns. I've got a couple of interns from Monash and Deakin at the moment, and they're working on some really interesting projects, one of which is going to be launched on Facebook soon. And I also meet with donors so that I can capture as much of the history of objects and collections as possible, so that these stories are not lost, because they are an essential part of these items. You can't just show an item without contextualising it or learning more about the family and creating these greater connections. One of the aims of the collections is to eventually have it launched online, and if you're familiar with the Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's websites, where they have a lot of their artefacts online, it does include very precise histories and, well, summarised, it describes what the object is. That's what we've been working very hard doing, but we need to have it very precise before it can be released online with images, very clear images, just to make it look really good. And what that will do is it will open up the JHC internationally. It means that researchers from the other side of the world will be able to do research in our collections by doing searches on specific towns, and also for you and me who are doing family histories, where someone can type in the name of a town or a surname and see if they can reconnect with a distant relative. So we try to ensure that the collections are presented in a comprehensive way. Okay, so the purpose of this session, as I said, was to increase your knowledge, awareness and understanding of Holocaust art, the motivations of the artists and some of the meanings attached to them. And this can mean while you're in the Holocaust Centre and also elsewhere. So even in other museums here or internationally, when you visit, hopefully you'll have a little bit more of an awareness of how these can be integrated into the overarching Holocaust narrative. Okay, and give you a deeper understanding of the meanings. So what I would like you to do is, when you are guiding eventually, or if you're doing it now, when you're walking through the museum, keep in mind, how can I use this artwork to assist in telling the story around it, and also if the students have just heard a story by a survivor guide, how can you use art to expand what they've been talking about. So look at where the artwork is positioned, where it is approximated within the narrative, and what other artefacts are around it, and start making these connections. Okay, so the art in the Jewish Holocaust Centre is by a range of artists of different backgrounds. We have works by Holocaust survivors as well as victims, and when I say artists, they were either professional before the war started, or they achieved some professionalism afterwards. We also have works by survivors who were not professional, it wasn't their first career, but they came to art later in life and they did pretty well at it. So we also have second and third generation artists who have that familiar connection with the Holocaust. We also have other people who have created art. They're not directly related, they might be related by marriage. And then we have some other people who are not connected at all, but they just have this affinity, or they need to express their artwork using the stories from the Holocaust. So, another category is war artists. And we categorise the different artworks according to significance. So what would you imagine would be the highest level of significance? Anyone?
Art by Holocaust survivor.
Yes, that's right. And even more so is art by a professional artist who went through the Holocaust. So someone who had already been a professional artist and created work during or straight after the Holocaust. And those works are quite rare, and particularly here. And a couple of examples, or 3 examples, are Walter Kreiser, Hermann Born, and I would also say Chaim Steyer, who was responsible for the Treblinka model to an extent. He was an artisan, but we will be discussing that just later on. Okay, but his work itself is of extremely high significance. So what's the purpose of Holocaust art? It can be, we need to establish why the artist would create a work. So ideas, I've got some up there, and it documents, to document daily life. There are some works that just show everyday duties, or there's one from, I think it's the Pithivers camp, where a man's just sitting there, so it just shows people. Alright, so just to go back to the purpose of artworks, when we examine the works, we can see that they have documented daily events in life and how this changed. Some of the works show how time was passed. There are works by children, and particularly the works which I know in the Theresienstadt Museum have a large collection of where children were drawing to pass the time. And we also have art with the intention of acting as material visual record. Art has also been created to honour those who were lost. And finally, art created as personal expression. So it's an emotional response when words are inadequate. So when we look at art, we seek to extend our understanding of the artist's experiences and how these fit in with historical events. And in the JHC art collection, often the works don't have comprehensive history, so we have to do a bit more research, and this can include video testimonies, trying to identify other artefacts that are connected, or just doing a wider research. But sometimes there are cases where there is no information other than a very brief biography. Okay, so the motivations to find out what they're depicting, that leads into more historical research, and the historical subject matter is something that we can look at and say, for example, if someone is showing a specific camp, and I know when I was doing a lot of research on Treblinka, it's a matter of reading up as much as you can about it, understanding what occurred, where it was situated, the chief, the major figures involved, and also reading about trials. And it's a very deep history, and always I know I feel that I don't know enough about everything, and of course it is impossible, but we try to build up on what we know. And it's difficult because the history is so vast and nuanced, and at every single place and every single camp there are so many details to learn. So what can you do? We just have to accept that, and that we can't know everything, but we can just keep trying to enhance our knowledge. Okay, so I just want to go through a little bit about art, and particularly war imagery and how that's been captured. I want to ask the question, what differentiates Holocaust art from general art? What do you think?
The Holocaust is an event that represents total agony, whereas general art, it's more basic. It's not as direct as the Holocaust is.
Is the Holocaust...
Best way.
Okay. So if you're examining a series of portraits of people and then you see a Holocaust scene, you can differentiate between the two different subject matters, and one is more emotional and
More direct.
more direct.
More meaning to it.
Okay.
Depth.
Sure. Anyone else? Yes?
Could we say as a history painting?
As a history painting? Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Okay. Anyone else? Yes?
I think it would be more confronting
More confronting?
and show us images that you don't normally see in your normal everyday life.
Sure. So, yes, yes?
I think they don't need to be different, they can be the same.
Mm.
I think because you can have sad paintings from any period, war scenes or whatever.
Yes.
You can have portraits of Holocaust victims, and you can have portraits of ordinary people. So I mean, I think what differentiates Holocaust art from general art is that Holocaust art is more restrictive
Right.
in its coverage. So you're not going to have flowers and vases and
It's not pretty.
pretty stuff like that.
Okay. So we expect specific symbols in the Holocaust art. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's more restricted, so you're not going to have happy scenes of children playing,
Right.
things like that.
Okay. Yes?
I think Holocaust art is meant by the artist to be enjoyed, so other artists their artwork.
Yes. Go on. Yes. Yes. Go on. Can you expand?
Well, an artist may create a work of art for his personal enjoyment or the enjoyment of people that view that art. But Holocaust art, I think, is an expression of the artist. It's a visual representation of a narrative that he's perhaps wanting to disseminate to people.
Right. Right. But my question, to go back to my question, and I completely agree, is that people who create Holocaust-themed artworks are creating it for us, an audience, to get something out of. So if it's emotional or historical or
I just wanted to say that that it's a unique event in history,
yes,
and therefore cannot be compared with anything else. Whether
Right.
it's pretty or ugly or emotional or educational, all those other things, it can be all of those things,
yes,
any of those things, as well as general art can be.
right,
But general art can never be Holocaust art because the Holocaust was unique.
right. It's about a specific
So they're
event.
comparable. Yeah.
Right, so it is about a specific event. And that's right, because when we think of Holocaust art, do you think of atrocity images? Yes. Do you think of people who were killed or lost or disappeared? Okay, so we straight away start thinking about very specific symbols and imagery. But those symbols and imagery, if you take away the veil of the Holocaust, they could be attached to, we see atrocity images all the time in the media. Okay, so what differentiates those atrocity images, and artists do work on other atrocities, is that it is specific to a historical event. And this is why you're here, because you think the Holocaust is important. Okay, but I don't think, I think that there are specific works that are accepted as art in a very generous way, to perhaps include people who are not professional artists and have exhibited works that would not be otherwise exhibited outside of the context of the theme. But in terms of what they're representing, unless it is directly connected to the Holocaust, there's nothing new about the forms of torture, maybe the industrialisation of it, and it has also increased, but it is about what the Holocaust means to you and me and in history in general. So I think it's important to examine just some similarities. So we're talking about the differences between, so the similarities are subject matter, imagery, the type of media that people use, paintings, photography, collage, installation. And here's an earlier piece by Goya. So art has always documented history. Portraits are not just pretty, they show the power and wealth of the sitter. Battle scenes depicted victories and losses. Religious art was designed to create awe. So Goya and Picasso, Goya's Disasters of War series, which was created between 1810 and 1820. And this was one of the least violent images that I could find. And it was based on the Spanish rebellion against the French imperial forces in 1808. Goya travelled to the battle sites and his drawings recorded the atrocity scenes. And if you've got the stomach to look them up, you'll see how graphic they are. Okay, and as mentioned, Guernica by Picasso, so from the rise of modernism in the early 20th century, artists were using contemporary aesthetic techniques to respond to the wars and conflicts. So previously, pre-modernism, where everything was depicted in a very realistic way, with the introduction of abstraction and different techniques, the subject matter continued, it was just shown in a different way. So Picasso, another Spanish artist, created this 3.5 metre tall by 7.75 metres long mural, Guernica, in June 1937 as a response to the bombing 2 months earlier of Guernica in the Basque region in Spain by the Italian fascists and German Nazis, directed by Spanish nationalists. The work, typical of Picasso's Cubist aesthetics, presents a composite of experiences within the visual plane. So you can see he's overlaid different events so that they act simultaneously. And so we saw Goya, and everyone knows this image pretty much, and so they're familiar and they record the atrocities of war. But what are the purposes of publishing or presenting these works? As in comparison or similar to Holocaust artworks? Anyone? They tell a story, yes. They are a record of historical events, yes. Yes.
They might sort of have some sort of political message, whereas maybe Holocaust art is more of a personal expression rather than sort of.
Okay, yes, I agree. And so artists can be making their own political statement. So are artists political? Yes. Of course they are, definitely. Tasman?
Of the way the artists use the historical event, you can see different sides of an historical event from different opinions.
Definitely, and that links in with the political views. So they're trying to present something that is aligned with their opinion. It's the same of how a photographer frames an image. What they leave out is just as important as what is included. And, well, photography was invented then, but pre-photography, art operated as the camera. And do you think that there are elements of propaganda? Okay. So what are the intended effects on the audience, emotionally as well as politically? Convince, sway, change people's opinions, shock them, make people aware of what's going on. So if someone can't decide whether, the Spanish nationalists are bad, now they know they're bad because they caused this. So it's a record, but it's also a piece that is to convince. A couple of works from the First World War. Here is a very traditional type of representation of soldiers who had fallen in battle by Christopher Richard Wynne Nevinson, Parts of Glory. Nevinson was one of Britain's most famous war artists. He had worked in the ambulance division very briefly, and then he was sent back to Britain and worked as an orderly and driver, but he witnessed a lot of the injuries, particularly of the new types of weaponry and armaments, where the horrific facial disfigurations, and he responded to that. So it was his work captured the horror of injuries that had never been seen before. However, that work on the left, which is very traditional, we can counter it with his slightly earlier work, Study for Returning to the Trenches, 1914 to 15, which, if you are familiar with art history, is of the futurist movement style, and the futurists, led by Marinetti, were obsessed with depictions of machinery, movement and industrialisation, and just thought I'd point out they were also fascists. So why am I including this? So I would like you to think about how earlier representations of war are aligned, and atrocities are aligned with Holocaust art. So is Holocaust art, for a generalised term, is it unique? What makes it unique, but what is it a continuation of? And I also think it's for those of you who aren't really that strong with your art history, you can always look at more artworks and note how there was that change from a literal representation, so a very naturalistic portrayal of soldiers, and very, a move from glorious looking battles, but also, soldiers falling in the fields, to artists taking on contemporary art styles and integrating those into their artworks, still on the topic of war and atrocities, but then, you have to understand that it doesn't have to be a literal representation to get the message across. Does anyone have any questions about that? Yes?
I was going to ask about the point where Holocaust art being aligned or a continuation of art history. Do you
Yes.
distinguish between professional and non-professional, like those that would have known about previous art and those that wouldn't have?
Yeah, I do. That's just...
Yeah, but to some, not.
But I've become a lot more generous. I think because I came from a very long-term serious art history background, with, we're talking about aesthetics, and excuse me, I'm just recovering from a cold. Where you're talking about philosophy of aesthetics and all of that. When I started working here a couple of years ago, it's like, okay, now what do? Because all of those theories need to be pushed aside, because there are some deeper issues that have more importance. So but it's always good to know what the formalities are. You have to know what the backgrounds are in order to understand why you can shift your views. So, talking about politics, this is one of my favourite artists. So, I was looking at artworks from, the interbellum era, and really obsessed with that whole early data business. But now it's interesting to see how that comes into here. So many artists of the early 20th century were highly political, and they used their various modernist styles to illustrate their political objectives. And from the rise of Nazism, opposition to fascist policies were emerging from artistic quarters. And one of the most prolific was John Hartfield, born Helmut Hirschfeld, a German artist who used collage techniques similar to the Dada as statements that read the sinister purposes of Hitler and the National Socialists. So that's both from 1932. What would you imagine would happen eventually if you're creating works like this?
Concentration camp where you did.
Exactly. So you're playing with fire. Okay, so he also worked with, Hartfield also worked with another famous artist, George Gross, and Hartfield was half Jewish. He fled to the United Kingdom during the war. Interestingly enough, he returned after liberation and lived in East Berlin until his death in 1968. Okay, and his grandson, also called John Hartfield, is carrying on his legacy. Very interesting. And so we're looking at the use of non-literal representation. I mean, this is not a photograph, it's a composite of what it is. Collage, montage, various forms of abstraction, and it can be understood as a method of combining a number of different objectives into the artworks, so representing the historical, the physical, the political and emotional, and often this is done simultaneously. So if you're talking about if someone said to you, Adolf swallows gold and spouts tin, that's an interesting way to say it, but if you show it in this way where you would never see a realistic, you would never see that in real life, this is what they're trying to achieve. Let's talk about monuments and memorialisation. This is the large scale. Here we are focused mostly on very small and intimate works, but I'm sure most of you are well travelled or intend to be and will have or will encounter large scale monuments either to do with the war in general, so both world wars or earlier wars, and as well as the various Holocaust memorials around the world. So these are public works and they commemorate significant historical events, and often the site that they are positioned at is significant, and we're all familiar with these works. They stand as communal headstones for the masses of the dead, and they're usually made in what type of medium are they made? Stone, marble, what else? Bronze, metal, anything else? Okay, what does that say?
Longevity.
Longevity, things are meant to last, okay, and they show power, strength, endurance. Okay, so has anyone been to Berlin and seen this? Okay, yes, anyone? I want to see how many people have been. Ooh, interesting. Okay. Alright, that's interesting. And can I just ask, did you go there because you knew that was there? Did you know about it beforehand? Okay. Or did anyone just walk down the street and encounter it?
Wanted to go there for the museum and then came across that.
Yeah.
So you went to the Jewish Museum and then you went down and saw it. So you didn't know that was there. Interesting. That's what I wanted to know. Okay, good. Alright. Right, because not everyone knows everything, not all of us know where to look, and sometimes I know my journey through art was very self-directed, and it's hard when you don't know where to look. Okay, so Eisenman's memorial. Eisenman is an American architect. It consists of a series of stone stelae of varying heights, and we can read it either as architectural archaeology, so something like ossified apartment blocks, or a layout of graves, and particularly Jewish. Why? Why would you say they are particularly Jewish graves? They're simple. Okay, so in the Jewish tradition, you're not meant to have anything fancy. It's supposed to be kept humble and not stand out. There are obviously exceptions.
Unless you're Russian.
What's that?
Unless you're Russian.
Okay. I personally don't think there's anything wrong with fancy, but it's more complying with a humbleness in death. Okay, but the thing with these graves is that they're not marked, so they are also the unmarked graves. There's no inscription, there's no gilding on them. And I just wanted to say, and I'm sure you will agree with me, that the sombre tone of this site does not stop the endless selfies and people using it as a location for fashion shoots and so forth. Yeah. But I mean, it personally, you know, or whether it personally offends you or not, is that because we are so connected or we have that interest, but some people aren't that interested in the Holocaust. Alright, so earlier this year I was in Warsaw and I got to photograph the Nathan Rappaport Ghetto Heroes monument, which I really, before I went there and had no idea of scale or position, it's quite, not confronting, but it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense, the fact that there are all these communist era apartment blocks behind it. And this monument was installed soon after the war, in April 1948, and it complies with the traditional notions of cenotaphic memorialisation. It's grand in scale, it uses those heavy materials, and it depicts the heroes of the uprising, including Mordechai and Elevis. And this is the other view, so who can tell me what that is in the background? Yes, Polin, the Museum for the History of Jews, which was completed in 2013. And I just noticed that the aperture, the entryway in Polin, it kind of replicates just the angle of the people and just that silhouette. Okay, and it sort of contextualises it. Usually when you have a major building, there's often a major sculpture in front of it, so I think it's quite complementary. Right, now something that's not made from stone or granite and marble is, and not made by a Holocaust survivor, is American artist Shimon Atty, who was born in 1957, and he created artworks where he projected photographs of pre-war Jewish life onto buildings, firstly in Berlin. They're not on the facades of buildings that match up with the photographs. And this was done in 1991 and 92, and then shortly after in Amsterdam. And this concept has lately been implemented on some really interesting websites like History Pin. Are you familiar with History Pin? Okay, when you go to History Pin, you will be addicted, I warn you. It's about matching imagery with places, with maps. So fabulous. It's fabulous. And there were instances where the artist had confrontations with the current residents of these buildings, and they were really offended, and they're saying, oh, but you know, this was legitimately sold to my father in 1938, or you know, I'm not Jewish, and because there's media around, I don't want people to think I'm Jewish. So these were some of the experiences that the artist had while he was doing those projections. But what is the element about the projections that is so important about this? Can someone tell me?
What Germany was.
Yes.
Like, for example, they had that Jewish culture.
Yes. So it's reminding them of their past. But what's the medium that the artist is using, and what's problematic about it?
Can't stay up.
Exactly. So it's fugitive. You switch off the projector and the image goes. The image disappears again. James E. Young, who writes extensively on Holocaust art and memorialisation, comments on this work. No doubt, some will see such work as supremely evasive, even self-indulgent art by a generation more absorbed in its own vicarious experiences of memory than by the survivor's experience of real events. Others will say that if artists of the second or third generation want to make art out of the Holocaust, then let it be about the Holocaust itself and not about themselves. The problem for many of these artists, of course, is that they are unable to remember the Holocaust outside of the way that it has been passed down to them, so how they've been informed of it, and outside of the ways it is meaningful to them so many years after the fact. And what do you think of that? Because this involves you, because being a non-survivor involved in Holocaust narratives, you and I are taking on these stories, and we're, I hate that word, distilling. We're capturing all of the different forms of narrative, whether it's films that we've watched, books we've read, testimonies we've heard, people we've spoken to, stories we heard growing up, and we're just capturing all of those and squeezing them into our bodies and then releasing them to this new audience in this desperate hope that we're going to convey something meaningful and, you know, to hopefully carry on that desire to memorialise the Holocaust.
Don't you have varying interpretations of how people see those images and the stories that have been passed on, and then
Yes.
passing it on to others, which can be distorted or can be varied?
Sure. Do you want to talk more about that? What are your thoughts on that? When the transmission of stories and how they can change or differ or be transmitted incorrectly?
We have a great responsibility because as second generation, those of us who are here, we heard stories, or we still hear stories from the survivors.
Yes.
After they're gone, the future generations, we have variations of those stories. Each one will be slightly dislocated or watered down versions or interpretations of how they thought the images that the survivors were talking about could be perceived and shown.
Sure.
So therefore you're going to lose something along the way. So how do you harness that and keep it in its more towards its original format, that the future generation can understand what we're talking about? Because eventually it can be said, great story, but really never happened.
This is the whole thing about proof. And when I work with materials of, you know, a fake ID card or a fake baptism certificate or photographs of people, you know, doing all sorts of activities before the war, you know, this is the thing where this is why we have to take such good care of these material objects. And if we're talking about art, you know, we have to take care of all the original art that was produced in the period that is testimonial art, which is what I'll eventually get to when I get through all of this. Okay, anyone else have any comments? Yes?
Isn't there a sort of a credible place for second or third generation of transmitted trauma? Because the reality is that a lot of things were not spoken about, particularly with second generation.
Yes.
And so, I don't know how this links in with documentation, but it sort of links for me in my head with artworks, is because it's very well documented that, because I even have students often will ask, and teachers have come to me and asked the question how it impacted on the second generation people, like myself and people I know who work here who were born just after the war or the end of the war or whatever. And that's a very important part of what happened, is how it gets transmitted and how it affects generational. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you do. It's,
yeah.
That's a big question. We can talk more about it at the end. In terms of how second generation artists would do that, this is the thing. So if they, and I know from recent experience, I've seen works by artists who are second generation or obliquely or sort of connected, and they use, I'm sorry?
The mouse, the cartoon.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a classic example of his extending his experience with his family as a second generation and how his relationships.
Yeah. Okay.
This is the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's move back to artworks. Because that's a really serious discussion, Okay, so you'll recognise this, at the Jewish Holocaust Centre entrance, Andrew Rogers' Pillars of Witness, which are based on familiar symbols and widely circulated atrocity photographs, is what you're greeted with, and its public position provides an exoskeleton to the museum. And it creates an external code as to what the JHC contains and its themes. And the components they were worked from photographs, pre-war atrocity, as well as familiar symbols connected with both Judaism and genocide, Stars of David, as well as disembodied limbs. But I think in a way it depicts a generalist symbolism and events, as well as the nameless and this seems to be sort of the opposite of what the interior offers, which is the personal, and the separate elements that made up this work can be individualised once you walk through the door, when you can hear a range of experiences of survivor testimony. You can look at the numerous photographs that depict people with names on them, and you can delve into the intimate stories that are conveyed alongside the artefacts. And I think that that's why it's really important to maintain this balance between public art, which is monumental and quite generalist, with the intimacy of what you find in these interior spaces of museums. And just as an example, I just couldn't find any, I didn't look for the photographs that made up the Pillars of Witness, but just as an example of how artists have extracted photographs that are very famous or well known, and they've used them in their artworks. The one on the paragraph on the left, which is just wood that's been burnt to create tone, it is based on an atrocity, well, not an atrocity photograph, but a photograph of Nazi harassment. And I just found this other photograph on the right where there are numerous images in the public domain that show that type of activity. So what do you think of art that takes imagery directly from photographs? What are your thoughts on it? Yes, no? Well, someone's, they haven't drawn a diagram, they haven't drawn from life, they haven't used a personal photograph. They've copied from a public domain photograph or something that is widely available, and they've created an artwork from that. What are your thoughts on it?
Is that interpretation?
It's interpretation, but what do you think about the emotional response, or is it personal or too impersonal?
It can be powerful, depending how it's done and how it's portrayed.
Sure. Okay.
And you're saying that photos are not art?
I'm sorry?
Are you saying that photos?
Is that art?
Is that art?
Is the photo on the right art?
Yes.
Is that art? So if you took well, let's be old fashioned, if you took 10 rolls of photos, would you say that every single photo is art?
No.
Okay. Now I have to indulge. One of my favourite pieces in this museum are these doors. I love these doors. I think they get overlooked. They are beautiful doors. Look at them, really. Okay, can I have your attention, please? Okay, I think they used to be the front door, but now they're safe positioned in the memorial room, and they include a stars formation of a 6-branched candelabra, or a menorah without its central light. The number 6 being symbolic, so you'll notice that there's a lot of works that contain the number 6. Why? I can have a few numbers. 6 million Jews as the generalised number. What else? 6 days of creation. The 6 points of the Star of David. Anything else?
6 years of the war.
6 years of the war.
60% of
I'm sorry?
60% of Jews and Europe's Jews were eliminated, so that's another perspective.
Yes, that's a good one. Yes.
No, I just said 6 minutes.
Okay, yes. So 6 is you will find the number 6 in a lot of, well, not a lot, but in a few works. Okay, other work that's installed in the museum that you may not, you know it's art, but you don't sort of refer to it as art. These are Adela Shaw's stained glass windows, and I think that they're vital works of memorialist art. They're positioned in different sections of the museum, so it's really interesting to see the way light comes through them or does not. And Adela Shaw was a survivor of Auschwitz, Maidanek, Bergen-Belsen. She died in 1997, and she was a prolific artist in this medium, and also donated her work to synagogues. And you'll see the different symbolic messages in her works, and you can see on the left she's included the striped concentration camp uniform. We've got doves. What else have we got? All villagers from the past. I'm sorry. A rainbow, yes, a rainbow, Star of David, some Jewish symbols, the lyre, it looks like Jerusalem in the background. Okay, so there's different symbols in those, but I think it's interesting. The one on the left is from the Rise of Nazism section. There's no light coming through whatsoever. So what do we think when we look at stained glass windows? What do you immediately think of?
Church.
Church or synagogues? so a religious space, okay? And it's like, I think it contributes to a sacred space within the museum. So before we start touring the actual works in the museum, I'd like to briefly touch on what their overall function is and how it works together with the artefacts. And as I said before, works by survivors are primary source materials, and they can be considered witness statements depending on what they depict, and they can also represent what the survivors have personally experienced or what they may have heard of or relatives experienced. And it's also important to examine them in the context of the emotional effect of the Holocaust on survivors, so survivors who have used artworks to express the long-term effects of anguish, loss, depression, grief and anger, and these are made visible through their works. Okay, so when we enter the museum and turn left, the first section that is presented is the Vanished World. These are the lives of European Jews before the rise of Nazism, and various family photographs of survivors, and that includes some survivor guides, adorn the walls, and many of these came from relatives abroad after the war. So when you have someone who's lost all their property, and I know that there are some photos that are the only photos of someone's parents that, because they were sent to a relative overseas, they managed to get a copy after the war. So these are very precious images, and the survivors use them to help illustrate their narratives. And interspersed with those photographs are some artworks, as you can see. And one of the messages that underlies this display is to demonstrate the variations of Jewish life in different parts of Europe, so the different ranges from different religious beliefs and political spectrum, and people were very secular or assimilated and modern, what they wore, whether they wore traditional, more old-fashioned dress or more modern, but what it's trying to demonstrate is that it didn't matter what variation of Jew you were according to the Nazi racial laws. A Jew was a Jew. So it didn't matter whether you were highly modern and even celebrated Christmas. If you were Jewish, you were a Jew. And positioned in alcoves amongst the Framed family photographs, a small bust in bronze and in painted clay by Sigmar Francis. And Francis was born in 1909 in Stryj in Poland, halfway between Lublin and Warsaw. He married Franziska Kaufmann in 1936, and their son Henry was born in 1938. When the Germans invaded Poland, he worked in the Boryslaw labour camp, while his wife and son were hidden by a Polish couple, Joseph and Aurelia Baran. He later joined them in an underground hiding place until they were liberated by the Russian army. And can anyone tell me somewhere else where they have seen this story of being hidden underground? Okay, I'd just like to see how closely you have paid attention to the works in the museum and made the connection. Okay, in the hiding section there are those two large reproduction paintings by a woman of the name of Andrea Sigmar Francis, any relative? Yes, that's the granddaughter. So that's Henrik's daughter, and she painted a version of the stories that she had been told. So this goes again to the transmission of stories and how they're represented. So, and that famous in a local sense image is used on the hide and seek brochures. So it shows the family living in a hole in the ground. And it's interesting to see the juxtaposition when you first enter the museum and you see these works, and then towards the end of your journey you'll see the granddaughter's works in the hiding section. Okay, so Sigmar Francis' mother was killed by the Germans, and of his wife's family only one sister survived, and he and his family arrived in Australia in 1950. He was an engineer prior to the war, and then he continued this profession after liberation, and he died in 2002. These works were made in the 1970s, so that places him in his 60s, and they're embedded with the vestiges of his memory, as well as wider influences either from the pre-war era or since. Okay, so how do we describe these works? He created types, so there's the rabbi, the scholar, the thinker, the Yiddish mama, the cheder boy, the young girl, philosopher, and do you think that this is the antithesis of what is trying to be achieved through the representation of personal family photographs that can be individualised by using these almost like stereotypes? What do you think about having that sort of placement when you've got these types of Jews placed amongst the individual Jews? So I see them as these figures connected with literature and plays of the pre-war era. So the work of the Yiddishists, like Shalom Aleichem, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and does anyone agree or disagree? I want to add to that. Okay, so these types have a longer tradition, so they link back to, the grandmother stories or the Bauermeisters, as well as the moral stories or aphorisms of the rabbis. So they have this long tradition of, telling a story about, give me an example, Gimple the Fool, these types, these stereotypes, but they're composites that are meant to represent something and give a moral story. So I think that they exist beyond just this representation. Oh yeah, there was a rabbi, but this is like a representation of a rabbi. I think it has more of a literary root. Just wanted to point out, and as you're coming in, you see the 6 souls, again 6, and when Sigmar Francis was hiding with his family in their underground pit, he would make small toys from wood and metal scraps to pass the time and amuse his son Henrik. So I think that this is a really essential link between these works that were made in the 70s and how they go back to his experiences underground in this, almost like a tomb. Okay, so while he was not, he was an engineer, which is good, but he was not a professional artist, but he has strong talent, and you can see influences of the type of, I'm making assumptions here obviously, but you can see what type of influences aesthetically he's incorporated from artists who have depicted religious Jewish life, such as Yaakov Adler and Chagall, yes, both of whom possessed Eastern European Jewish religious roots, but expressed this through contemporary avant-garde art. And often you will see Holocaust survivors who took up art later in life, taking inspiration from art movements from their formative years, so from the 1920s, 30s and 40s, or when they were younger. Let's move to the Rise of Nazism section, and we encounter Walter Preiser for the first time, and a little about Preiser. He was born Walter Preiser in 1899 in Posen, Poland, and later moved to Berlin. And after professional training as an artist, he worked for many years creating illustrations for niche publications such as limited edition artist books and also for commercial magazines. And from what I found of his pre-war work, he was very talented and adaptable, and his style aligns with many of his contemporary artists. Stylistically, shows very modernist roots, as well as the technical precision that he has in printmaking, and as a former printmaker, this is something I really relate to. And for the crime of Rassenschande, which is relations with an Aryan woman, and I think, just from recent research, I think he was married to a non-Jewish woman. He was sent to prison in 1938, then to Sachsenhausen, Grossrosen and Duna, which is a sub-camp of Auschwitz, until January 1945. So he was incarcerated for the duration of the war. It's unbelievable. And he was liberated by the British on the 4th of May 1945. After the war, he taught art and dressmaking or pattern making at the Art School in Kiel until 1951. He migrated to Melbourne after that, and he lived in Melbourne until his death in 1980. And we don't have a video testimony of Pricer, unfortunately, but prior to his death, and it was as though he knew death was on its way. He had cancer, so he knew that death was impending. He wrote a testimony, and there's a copy of it in the library titled Shades of Black. And I was reading some documentation that he had donated, well, that had been donated about getting that book published, and the publishers were saying, oh, you know, it's unemotional, it's really dry, and you know, we don't want to publish it. And he was sending it to New York and to London, and he was responding and saying, well, you know, I don't want to be too emotional so that people don't think I'm being precise. I want to just say it as it is. And when you go through the other sections of the museum and you see the rest of his works, you can see how, you know, how precise that attitude has transferred to his artworks. So I just wanted to show his technical precision here. That's obviously one of his drawings. And during his incarceration, he was drawing sketches of guards, of their wives, their girlfriends, their mistresses, and of the guards themselves. And often this would help him get special favours, but it did not mean that it saved him completely from, you know, not getting beaten up or, you know, in being treated badly. So, but he was put into specific departments where he was not for, you know, in forced labour, for example. And he, keep in mind, he was around 40 years old when he went into the camps at the start. Okay, so there was an incident. I mean, it didn't exclude him from physical violence, but it certainly earned him better conditions and occasional promotions.
Is that him on the left?
That's him on the left, and that's him. That's a drawing, a self-portrait of him on the right. Okay, so I just wanted you to see how how skillful he is. Okay, so there was an incident towards the end of the war when, after a march back into German territory to a forced labour camp, he was recognised by a man who had purchased his limited edition, very niche, very expensive artist books before the war, and took him off the forced labour duty. And by the end of the war, you can imagine how bad his health would have been, that by doing so, that saved his life. Opposite the Treblinka model, this is the section on camps, and there are reproductions of the Pricer artworks on the wall. Works on paper are very delicate, I won't go into that, but it's to have them at, you know, visual height. So in front of you, the Kristallnacht one is positioned quite high up. These ones are lower, so they've been reproduced. I just wanted to add that a young man Walter Pricer took under his care in Auschwitz is Joseph Spring. Does anyone know who Joseph Spring is? Okay, he's one of our survivor guides. And he was the reason why Walter ended up migrating to Australia. And Pricer created this series of woodblock prints right after the war in Ort, and that's the organisation for retraining. That was a Jewish organisation to get people who had survived the war to retrain them in different industries like sewing, or so that they could rehabilitate and get back into the world. But there was also already that notion that they had to capture their testimonies, and Walter did this through his artworks, and it demonstrates the urgency and need to record as an emotional outpouring, and also the need to depict the detailed events of barbarity. And as we know, Holocaust denial had already started. Later in the 70s and 80s, there was another wave of Holocaust denial, and that included David Irving, and we'll get to that in a minute. There's another work that is extremely precious to us that came into the collection only late last year, and this is an architectural plan of Oranienburg concentration camp in just outside Berlin. And Hermann Bohm was a professional architect before he was incarcerated, and he did this drawing as well as 4 other drawings of his experiences. So this is extremely rare and very precious to us. And the story is that he was assisted out of Germany with his family and by the Catholic Church, and they subsequently immigrated to Australia. According to his children, Hermann Bohm did not speak of his experiences during his about his experiences of being imprisoned, but as a professional architect and by extension an artist, these sketches encapsulate the degradation and torture of predominantly Jewish inmates arrested after Kristallnacht. And the testimony by the descendants, and that's what we were sort of touching on before, is that because Hermann didn't give an oral video testimony, it's been down to his son and daughter, who are the last 2 of his 4 children, to fill in as much detail as possible. So they've given a video testimony, and they've been doing some research of their own. So, but it is naturally incomplete, and these powerful drawings will remain the only personal testimony of Hermann Bohm. So other art that's been used as testimony, and this is the Polish artist David Aller, who's spent a lot of time in France, but he was in Auschwitz, he was a Sonderkommando, and his formal depictions of the gas chambers and crematoria were used as testimony for the Deborah Lipstadt versus Holocaust denier David Irving trial in 1996. Okay, so other works that depict the events in the concentration camps include these ones, which are from the Archivist Museum. We don't have very many, so the ones that we have here, we are very proud of. We look after them very well, and they're very important to us, particularly when we have a connection with the artist. We've looked at monumentalism, memorialism, a little bit on artist witness testimony, and I want to continue on this theme with the Treblinka model, which dominates the museum. And Heimsteyer built this model in 1984 to 85, and I have spoken quite extensively on this model. I delivered a conference paper in Akko in Israel in March, and it's on YouTube. Embarrassing, but it's there, so me looking extremely jet lagged. If you can look it up or get the link from Lisa. So I'll keep this analysis quite brief, although I could discuss this model endlessly, and I just want to say that doing the Treblinka research is really hard going, so make sure you give yourself a bit of a break when you find yourself in the depths, because sometimes you can get into the depths and it can be very hard to come out of it when you're reading about some really horrific details, and the reading about these historical details is necessary to get a deeper understanding of the history. Okay, one of the greatest attributes of this model is its rarity, and the fact that Steyer, who built this model, was one of less than 70 people to have survived the Treblinka uprising in August 1943. He had worked as a Sonderkommando for nearly a year by this time, first sorting out the possessions of Jews for a couple of weeks, and then for the next 11 and a half months being located in Treblinka 2, which is where they were taking care of body disposal. This is a site where, who knows, is Treblinka a memorial site these days? Does anyone know? It's a fallow field. Why is it a fallow field? They destroyed it. So soon after the uprising, the Nazis instructed for it to be bulldozed over, and then they built a little farmhouse and positioned a Ukrainian farmer and his family onto it. Nothing's here. Okay, but there's been some archaeology recently, I understand. They're doing, what is it, sonar imaging or something?
It's a young woman British archaeologist. There was a program on Foxtel
Yes.
about it.
Yes.
And they're doing sonar to try and locate the gas chambers, and all they found up to the time when I saw the program
Yes.
was a bit of a Morgan Dobbard
Right.
in ceramic that I think was on the walls of the showers.
Okay, so there was, from writings, there was and we can see in this next image, well, that's where people are lining up to go to undress and leave their possessions, and on the right, this is the tube that led to the gas chambers, and they used, and this is something that I picked up on from a couple of sources, is that they had embroidered velvet curtains that were stolen from a synagogue, and they put the synagogue, which cover the ark, which is where the Torahs are stored, so that's the holy curtains, and they put these curtains in front of the entrance to the gas chamber, and Steyer has depicted that there, and they lined that narrow pathway with high hedges and also flowers, and it was Himmelstrasse, or the road to heaven. And apparently there was a Magen David above the entrance as well, so maybe that's what they're referring to. I need to see that. Okay, so how do we approach this model and understand it? It's so complex. You know, do we look at it as a work of art? Do we look at it as a model? Is it in the tradition of those tabletop tableaus of war scenes that I think people of a certain generation may not know, the younger generation may not know, but the older of us will be familiar with in museums where they would have those little scenes playing out. We need to understand that the spatial organisation of the layout of the Treblinka is of a reality according to the artist Steyer, where the precision of measurement was not possible, and obviously you can't go back and measure things, and there were some areas of the death camp that Steyer could not access, such as the Nazi quarters or the Ukrainian guard quarters. But he did have access to the entranceway, and he was working in that section at first, and then he was in Treblinka 2, which he has depicted in detail. And there are other models of Treblinka, the famous Viennik model in the Lochamei Ghetto Art Museum, the Ghetto Fighters Museum in the Galilee in northern Israel, but that model is devoid of figures, whereas Steyer has included people. He's made cutouts or little models, and he's included that. So what does that do by including people in your tableau? What does it do? Humanises it, it personalises it, and we also have to keep in mind that Steyer's first wife and his infant child were killed immediately upon arrival, shortly after arrival, so it's like his memorial to them. Okay, he's also included Franz Stangl, the head SS commandant, which you can see on the right hand side in the back, wearing white. He's to wear white, and I'm currently reading the Gitta Saroni last interview with him, which is ugly. Okay, so how do we approach this model and attempt to understand it? What are the different layers of meaning, as we've discussed before? Can I hear from you?
The testimony.
Testimony. So it's a testimony of?
The testament of history.
The testament. So he's depicting what he saw. Okay, what else is it? Compared to other works that we've seen earlier?
3D.
Realistic.
Realistic?
Concrete.
Concrete?
3D.
3D, okay, so instead of a plan or a diagram, you can see he has tried to depict how high the hedge-covered walls, perspectives. Okay, alright, but the issue is that if you compare it to the other models and other plans, they all differ, okay, and this model has been criticised that, you know, some parts are completely incorrect. This is a compressed space, so it's real according to Steyer, but it's his personal reality of his memory. But it also, there's another element to this model. It's the emotional element. Where do you see that?
Piles of bodies. Piles of bodies.
Piles of bodies are designed to do what?
Show the horrors.
So they provoke a reaction of the people looking at this model and examining it and seeing, you know, these horrific circumstances of not just the dead, but these people who were forced to dispose of the dead.
Anna, it's really important that the victims are all individualised in his model as well.
Okay,
So
so
by giving faces,
yes.
but they're not just anonymous.
Yes.
They've been really personalised by him.
Yes, so I've spoken to his daughter Malka quite extensively about this, and she was she acknowledged that he really wanted to re-individualise, and I mean, you've got the bodies being destroyed at the back, but the people walking through are, you know, trying to show them as. Yes.
Did he ever corroborate sort of his impressions with another survivor?
I think he did, and I think that he actually went to the Lockerbie Ghetto Art in the Ghetto Fighters Museum and saw the Viennick model there, and he said, according to Malka, no, it's not like that, that's not how it was at all. And then I'm going to make my own. So that's what he did. So that's what I mean by, you know, people, when you have witnesses in any situation, you always have different perspectives, different points of view. Isn't it?
I think the context in which he made it as well is important. That it sat in his living room for so long.
Yes.
When he was creating it, shows that he put so much effort, and I think that was part of his everyday life.
Yes.
Remembering and memorialising it in his own living space.
Yes. Yeah. And when I talk, if you see how or hear me talk more about it, I talk about how it's like this manifestation of everything that he kept inside of him just had to come out. The other issue that I wanted to bring in, which because we don't have Chaim Steyer with us anymore, is that he, in his Shoah Foundation testimony, he was using the model with his pointer to describe what he was talking about. So, say for example, I was describing a work of art to you or a person. If I described a person to you, oh, she's got blonde hair, she's got green eyes, she's about 5'7", she likes to wear, you know, frilly dresses or something like that. You'd start creating this picture in your mind, and then I'd take out my phone and show you a photo of this person I'm talking about. Oh, they look completely different to what I thought, or oh yeah, that kind of matches up to your description. So what does that say? The value of these artistic testimonies is that you have, as I mentioned earlier on, it's the photograph where there were no cameras. So it's, even though the framing is here or there, there's a bit of distortion to the image, but the artworks contribute so much in illustrating narratives. They illustrate how things look like, how things were before the war, how things were in the camps, and they can also clarify things. And I know recently we're just going through a collection where my intern can't understand, how did this man come through these concentration camps or labour camps, and he had all his ID cards, he had all these photos, he had this and that and this and that, and then it's like, oh, that doesn't sound right. We know, like in Archivist, you had everything, all your possessions stripped of you, but then you find out there were variations. So it's, you know, some labour camps you could keep you could have a small suitcase full of luggage. And I found drawings from the Terezin ghetto, Theresienstadt, where you could see drawings of the barracks, and they'd have, you know, 3 layers of beds, but then underneath there would be a suitcase. So that it just demonstrates that there are examples where people didn't always have all of their possessions stripped away from them, and that can go towards answering that question. Okay, so again speaking with Malka, Malka said that her father, and he died in 2002, aged 98, which was very good. He never varied his stories about his experiences. So, and she also said he had such a photographic memory. And I want to point out, and I did mention earlier, maybe he wasn't a professional artist or a trained artist, but he was a very skilled craftsman, and he was a cabinet maker, and he did very, according to Malcolm, made very decorative woodwork and some fittings. So he knew how to make things and depict things. Okay, so this is another example. This is Samuel Willenberg, who was the last survivor of the Treblinka uprising, and he passed away in February this year. He was an artist, and he was the son of another artist, Peretz Willenberg, who did the mural of the Czestochowa synagogue, and he also has depicted Treblinka. So this is where we do have very few but good comparative examples. And Willenberg also created sculptures, and they're quite naturalistic. They depict his experiences, and but he used them as adjuncts along with his oral testimony. So he would always speak about his experiences, but he would use his drawings as well as his artwork as a way of enhancing people's understanding. And in some ways they act as witness statements representing the artist's or the survivor's experience, but I think they can also operate as testimony for those who were murdered, and they are all-encompassing stories to address that absence. And I think in this way they expand into memorials. Okay, so we have a few works in the museum that are created by JHC Survivor Guide and recent nonagenarian, Sarah Saroni. And Sarah, who spent her teenage years in the war hiding in plain sight, took up art later in life, but always had a love for it. And she has produced some compelling works in the medium of clay and bronze. We have video and written testimony by Sarah, and she's published books, and this will give you the background of her experiences in the war. Now, she was born in Poland, and she assumed a false identity, and she worked in a factory where her Jewish identity could have been disclosed at any moment. But she lost nearly all of her family in the Holocaust. She immigrated to pre-state Israel and then to Australia. And in her autobiography, she wrote of her time in Rome after liberation, I think where she was in transit to emigrate to Australia, where she was gazing on sculptures, public sculpture in absolute wonder, and the sculptures that she produced later in her life and over the years include references to Holocaust horrors that she did not personally experience, and they include scenes of deportations, the barracks and the concentration camps, and that's the image in the case, just to your left. They are inclusive as well, so they may not be witness testimony, but they connect to the wider notion of the interconnection between Jewish people or people who had experienced the Holocaust, and they are emotionally wrought and they affect the viewer. And I see them in a similar manner, yes and no, to the Roger sculptural plaques as photographs made three-dimensional, but I don't think that they are as distant as the Pillars of Witness, because she went through these historical events herself. But I also think, I get this sense that each of the figures is Sarah's self, so she's mapped herself onto each of the figures which means that she's imagining herself as that person in that scenario. And I think that that sense of immersion prevents these works from being depersonalised. And I think one of the most moving pieces that she has created is the Korchak. Oh, I love this. This work is just terrible and beautiful, and I wish one day it could be made into this in a grand scale. This is in the children's section of the museum, as you would know, and this is where the school groups usually conclude their tours, so you know what a place to end up at. This sort of totemic format of Korchak, who was a head of an orphanage, a children's author, and who had the opportunity to escape from Poland, but decided to stay with his orphans and accompany them to Treblinka. It's just extremely heartbreaking. So this is why I am often happy that I'm locked away in my little office, and you have to face these people in a very strong way.
That was my first story that came out, because, as I said, for 42 years I couldn't talk about it. And I started to sculpt by the end of 81. I'm self-taught, and that was done in 83. I don't know what made me do it. And I created a scene about the Holocaust. And after that, I became obsessed. I had to get it out of my system.
Yeah. So had you seen photos that you knew that it looked like this or anything? Just from
memory, from my imagination.
Yeah. Tell me a bit about this sculpture here.
That was done in 86.
Yes.
That's how I imagine, not that I saw it, how they looked, because I saw people how they looked after they came from the camps.
Yes.
And those people supposed to be liberated.
And they're not really liberated, are they? They're sort of barely living, basically. Yeah. And this is. How long would one of these sculptures take you?
That's a. It's not. First of all, I did it straight away in wax, because normally you do it in clay, then you take a mold. But that one you can't take a mold. It's impossible because you got too many. You know, you have to have hundreds of pieces. You can't.
Yeah.
So I did it straight away in wax.
Okay.
And I did all the work nearly myself. The only thing they did in the foundry was to pour the bronze, because I wasn't allowed to, you know, red hot bronze, and patina. And they did, because that's with fire. All the rest I did myself.
Now you saw where she was standing, how she was talking about that work. So you've got the atrocity photos next to it, and she is a witness. She was saying that she saw how people looked after they were liberated, and that is what she's trying to represent. So although she hadn't been through the camps, she had contact and she saw the state that people were in after liberation. Okay, so, but just as a reminder, is that you can incorporate that artwork when you are talking about that element, that section. So it's just a way of another media. So you've got the photos of the atrocities, but you also have an artistic representation of it. Now there's a very small but highly significant work that we have in the museum, and this is the small drawing of a woman in Bergen-Belsen, and this was done by Alan Moore, who was an Australian war artist, and he died less than a year ago at the age of 101. So very good. Recently, we were approached by the Australian War Memorial in Canberra to loan a range of Holocaust artefacts that are going to be installed in a gallery which has Alan Moore artworks on one side and some other works by Holocaust survivor Bernard Slavik on the other side. So I've been working closely getting 5 different collections together. There are about 31 artefacts altogether in total, and I think the exhibition is going to open at the end of towards the end of this year. So this is the first time that they will have comprehensive Holocaust artefacts in the Australian War Memorial, and it's all thanks to Lisa and Jane for pointing out the absence. Thank you very much. Okay, after various experiences through the war as an artist, Moore witnessed the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen camp on 15th of April 1945. He recorded his observations in paintings, drawings and photographs, and he has said that when he got there and was just devastated beyond belief, he started sketching, and a British soldier came up to him and said, well, why are you sketching? You've got a camera, start taking photos. People are not going to believe this. They are not going to believe what is here. If you start sketching, they could say you've manipulated it or that's not true, and also time was of the essence, so that you can take a number of many more photographs capturing the different scenes compared to the drawings, compared to sitting there and drawing. Okay, and one of the stories that is going to be included in the War Memorial exhibition is video testimony of Alan Moore with a Holocaust survivor, and the story behind that is that while he was in Belsen, he was followed around by a young girl, and they were reunited many years later in the 1970s by a friend in common, and that young girl was Helen Schön, who lives in Melbourne. So it was this amazing reconnection. And there was a recent article, if you just Google Alan Moore Helen Schön, S-C-H-O-N, you will find this article. It's very but they kept in contact. So I would like you, however, to, next time you're in the museum, to have a closer look at this very small drawing and have a look in the upper right of the drawing. I'm not sure if you can pick it up from here. Anyone see it? Anyone see it? What do you see? Maybe you can't see it. Upper right, just behind the woman. Just behind her shoulders.
Is that a face?
Yes, it's another figure. It's like this ghost-like, shadowy figure behind her. Okay, so we're up at the front, just towards the end. Let's talk about the next generation and the future of Holocaust art. And when we talk about the meaning of Holocaust art, it's essential that we look to the future. So who will continue with these stories when the eyewitnesses have moved on to a better place? And art of the second and third generation has long commenced. There are also artists without direct connection to survivors or victims that have created works with Holocaust subject matter in the context of contemporary themes. And you can see that throughout the JHC, and that includes this is the Andy Krantz. These are the Krantz ones that I was referring to much earlier. And this is David Rankin's The Drowned and the Saved. And David Rankin, who's a well-known Australian artist, is married to whom?
Lily Brett.
Okay, there you go. All right, and so it connects the subject matter on a personal level, and Lily Brett's parents were survivors. Okay, so commenting on Lily Brett's novel To Many Men, post-memory academic Marianne Hirsh, no relation, who is also coming out through Monash, it's unbelievable, notes that the novel belongs to a genre of Holocaust narrative that has been increasingly prevalent in recent years. The narrative of returning, which a Holocaust survivor accompanied by an adult child, returns to his or her former home in Eastern Europe, or in which the children of survivors return to find their parents' former homes, to walk where they once walked. Hirsh points out that these narratives of return are quest plots holding out and forever frustrating the promise of revelation and discovery. Okay, so another theorist, Dora Appel, has called these next generation artists secondary witnesses. She notes that there are many of these artists who have also inherited the trauma that they are depicting, as you mentioned before, as part of artistic immersion. And I think we saw this in the Shimon-Atti projections. These fugitive pieces make us fear that eventually the Holocaust is going to fade from memory and importance. And it's not surprising as the generations go on and other atrocities and tragedies and wars keep on going. So the question remains, who bears responsibility of continuing to tell Holocaust stories through artworks and other narratives? And is this a responsibility? What is it? I don't know. So to conclude, we can discuss that in a minute. This is a work in the archives that I get to look at and go, oh, Lisa, this is my art appreciation. Oh, look at that. I have presented a small range of works from the collection. I haven't gone through all of them. I haven't looked at all of them, as was pointed out earlier. There are some that I have studied in depth and have included examples of works that show witness testimony, formal war art, atrocity images and a bit about that history, emotional representations, non-survivor art, and the considerations for the future. So I would just like to conclude by suggesting that when you are guiding to, or when you're just going through, preparing to guide, examine some of the artworks, and same as with the artefacts, see if you can incorporate these artworks and the artefacts and the testimonies into your guiding, because I think it contributes to a more detailed understanding of the experiences and of documentation of the Holocaust. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.